The Nile River has flowed through the heart of Africa for thousands of years, a ribbon of life cutting through deserts, kingdoms, and empires. It is not only a river, but a force of history, the silent witness to the birth of civilization itself. Along its banks, humanity learned to farm, to organize, to build, and to dream. But in the modern age, this same river has become the center of one of the world's most dangerous disputes. Two of Africa's oldest nations, Egypt and Ethiopia, now stand on the edge of confrontation, each convinced that their survival depends on control of the same vital waters. To understand why Egypt and Ethiopia are on the brink of war, one must go back not years but millennia. Egypt's relationship with the Nile is not just political, it is existential. The ancient Egyptians built an entire civilization around its cycles of flood and fertility. Even today, over 95% of Egypt's population lives within a few kilometers of the river. Without the Nile, there is no Egypt. Its cities, its farms, its very identity are sustained by this single artery. It is no exaggeration to say that the Nile is Egypt's lifeline, a source of life that turns a desert into a nation. Ethiopia, on the other hand, is the Nile's source of power. Over 80% of the water that reaches Egypt originates not in Egyptian territory, but in the Ethiopian highlands from the Blue Nile, which begins at Lake Tana and joins the White Nile in Sudan, to form the great river that flows north into Egypt. For centuries, this fact was a matter of geography, not politics. But in the modern era, when water means energy, food, and sovereignty, the question of who controls the Highlands, Nile's flow has become one of the most contentious issues in African geopolitics. At the center of this dispute lies one project, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD. Announced in 2011, the GERD represents Ethiopia's grand ambition to harness the Blue Nile's immense hydropower potential and generate electricity for itself and its neighbors. The dam, one of the largest in the world, is a symbol of national pride and independence, a project funded largely by Ethiopians themselves, without reliance on Western financial institutions. For Ethiopia, it is not merely an energy project, but a statement of sovereignty and progress, the promise of lifting millions from poverty. But for Egypt, the GERD represents something else, an existential threat. The fear in Cairo is simple, that Ethiopia's control over the dam could mean control over the river's flow. Egypt depends on the Nile for more than 90% of its fresh water. A prolonged reduction in water flow, especially during drought years, could devastate its agriculture, its economy, and its population. For Egyptian leaders, this is not just a technical dispute about hydrology. It is a national security crisis. In the years since construction began, both sides have framed the issue in terms of survival and justice. Ethiopia argues that it has every right to develop and use its own resources. Why, they ask, should one nation's progress be limited by another's historical privilege? Egypt, on the other hand, insists that the Nile's flow must be protected to ensure the survival of more than 100 million people downstream. The result is a clash not only of interests, but of narratives, between history and modernity, between old treaties and new realities. Those old treaties are part of the problem. In 1929, and again in 1959, colonial-era agreements allocated nearly all of the Nile's waters to Egypt and Sudan, leaving Ethiopia with no formal share, even though the Blue Nile originates within its borders. These treaties were signed under British colonial oversight and are considered illegitimate by Ethiopia, which was never a party to them. For Ethiopia, the colonial-era water arrangements are relics of an unjust past, denying African nations the right to use their own natural resources. For Egypt, however, those treaties represent binding legal frameworks that guarantee its water rights, agreements that have formed the basis of its entire agricultural and urban planning systems for decades. This historical tension has now evolved into a modern geopolitical standoff. When Ethiopia began filling the GERD's reservoir in 2020, Egypt and Sudan protested fiercely, warning that the move could destabilize the entire region. Diplomatic negotiations, mediated by the African Union, the United States, and the World Bank, have repeatedly stalled. Each side accuses the other of intransigence. Cairo demands a legally binding agreement on how the dam will be filled and operated, particularly during droughts. Addis Ababa insists on flexibility, rejecting any agreement that it perceives as limiting its sovereign right to manage its own dam. Behind these technical arguments lies a deeper issue, the question of trust. Egypt fears that Ethiopia, in its pursuit of energy independence, could use the dam as leverage, releasing or withholding water as a political tool. Ethiopia, meanwhile, views Egypt's concerns as a continuation of old patterns, an attempt by downstream powers to dictate how upstream nations can use their own resources. The two nations, bound by geography, are trapped in a zero-sum perception. What one gains, the other loses. Regional dynamics have made the situation even more complex. Sudan, which lies between the two, has found itself caught in the middle. On one hand, it shares Egypt's dependence on the Nile. On the other, it stands to benefit from the GERD through cheaper electricity and regulated water flows that could reduce flooding. But internal instability within Sudan, including its own violent conflicts, has weakened its ability to mediate effectively. International powers have also taken an interest. The United States, China, the European Union, and Gulf states all have strategic stakes in the region. Egypt's long-standing alliance with Washington contrasts with Ethiopia's deepening ties to China and Turkey. The dam itself has become not only a national project, but a symbol of Africa's shifting alliances, away from Western tutelage and toward multipolar partnerships. As the years have passed, rhetoric has hardened. Egyptian officials have repeatedly declared that all options are on the table to protect their water security. Ethiopia, equally firm, has vowed that no force on earth will stop the completion and operation of the dam. Military exercises, diplomatic posturing, and propaganda campaigns have created an atmosphere of escalating tension. Though open war remains unlikely, the potential for miscalculation is real and deeply dangerous. The Nile Basin is one of the most densely populated regions in the world, home to over 250 million people across 11 countries. A major conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia would not only be catastrophic for those two nations, but could destabilize all of East Africa and the Horn. It could disrupt trade routes, fuel migration crises, and invite external powers to intervene, each pursuing its own interests under the banner of peacekeeping or mediation. Yet beneath the surface of tension, there are moments of potential cooperation. Both nations recognize that outright conflict would be disastrous. Egypt's military advantage, including advanced weaponry and regional alliances, is offset by the sheer logistical challenge of projecting force so far south. Ethiopia's determination and geographic control of the Nile sources give it leverage, but not immunity from economic and political pressure. Each side understands that the river can either unite or destroy them. The path forward, analysts argue, lies in shared management, transforming the Nile from a source of rivalry into a foundation for regional integration. Cooperative frameworks already exist, such as the Nile Basin Initiative, which includes all riparian states. But political mistrust and national pride have prevented meaningful progress. Egypt fears that cooperation might erode its historical dominance. Ethiopia worries that agreements could perpetuate inequality. What is missing is a sense of collective destiny, the belief that the prosperity of one nation need not come at the expense of another. Understanding why this conflict feels inevitable requires looking beyond politics and into the human heart of both nations. For Egyptians, the Nile is not just water. It is identity. It is written into their poetry, their religion, their sense of place. To imagine a diminished Nile is to imagine the end of Egypt itself. For Ethiopians, the Blue Nile represents dignity, the assertion that Africa's resources can serve Africans first, without permission from former colonial centers. Each nation is fighting for more than control. They are fighting for meaning, for recognition, for justice as they see it. This emotional depth is what makes the dispute so intractable. Every negotiation is shadowed by history, every technical proposal burdened by symbolism. The GERD may be a dam of concrete and steel, but it also dams centuries of mistrust, resentment, and aspiration. And until that emotional reservoir is managed, the physical one will remain a flashpoint. As we look deeper into this story, into the economic realities, environmental pressures, and political calculations shaping the standoff, it becomes clear that the Nile conflict is not only about water, it is a reflection of the world's broader struggle between scarcity and abundance, between old powers and emerging ones, between fear and cooperation. The next part of this exploration will uncover those deeper layers, how climate change, demography, and global politics have turned a river into a fault line, and how Egypt and Ethiopia, two ancient civilizations, are navigating the most delicate crisis of the modern African century. As we move deeper into the story of Egypt and Ethiopia's confrontation, we begin to see that this is not merely a dispute over water, but a struggle at the intersection of climate, economics, and identity. The Nile River is more than a natural resource. It is the single thread that ties together the destinies of 11 nations. Yet it is also a finite thread, and one being pulled tighter every year. The Nile Basin is already one of the most water-stressed regions in the world. The populations of Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia are growing rapidly. Ethiopia's population has surpassed 120 million, and Egypt's has crossed 110 million. Each year, millions more are born into societies where water use is already stretched to the limit. Meanwhile, climate change has begun to alter rainfall patterns in the Ethiopian highlands and increase evaporation rates in the Egyptian delta. For both countries, this means one terrifying reality. The river's flow, once predictable, is becoming uncertain. In Ethiopia, climate volatility has meant years of drought alternating with years of intense flooding. The construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam was in part a response to this new era of unpredictability. By controlling the river's flow, Ethiopia sought stability, the ability to store water and generate reliable energy. But for Egypt, the same structure represents potential vulnerability, the possibility that a political crisis or climate emergency could combine to cut off the nation's lifeline. This shared dependence has created a paradox. Both Egypt and Ethiopia face the same threat, water insecurity, but each believes its security can only come at the other's expense. In truth, the situation demands cooperation more than competition. A coordinated management plan could benefit all riparian nations, balancing irrigation, energy, and ecological stability. Yet such coordination remains elusive, trapped in cycles of mistrust. The role of international actors has only made the picture more complex. The United States has long seen Egypt as a cornerstone of stability in the Middle East and North Africa. For decades, it has provided Cairo with substantial military and financial aid. Washington's attempts to mediate the GERD dispute were initially viewed as favoring Egypt, leading Ethiopia to pull out of talks in 2020. Accusing the U.S. Treasury of bias. China, on the other hand, has become Ethiopia's largest development partner, funding infrastructure projects across the country, including components related to the GERD. For Beijing, the dam represents not just economic cooperation, but a statement of China's growing influence in Africa, an alternative to Western-backed financial systems. Meanwhile, Gulf states, particularly the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, have sought to position themselves as mediators, partly to maintain stability in the Red Sea corridor, a vital route for global trade and energy exports. This geopolitical competition adds layers of complexity. Each external actor brings resources, but also agendas. For the Nile dispute, foreign involvement has been a double-edged sword, offering technical expertise and diplomacy on one hand, and deepening suspicions of manipulation on the other. In the eyes of many Africans, the dispute has become a test of whether the continent can resolve its own conflicts without external interference. Within both nations, domestic politics have shaped their stances. For Egypt's leadership, defending the Nile is a political imperative. Any compromise perceived as weakness could carry heavy domestic costs. Egypt's government frames the Nile as a matter of survival, reinforcing the image of a nation under siege by forces beyond its control. The language of existential threat strengthens national unity, but leaves little room for flexibility at the negotiating table. In Ethiopia, the GERD has been equally politicized, a project that unites the nation across ethnic and regional lines in a time of great internal division. Ethiopia has faced multiple internal crises in recent years, from the Tigray conflict to political transitions that have strained its unity. The dam serves as a symbol of collective achievement, the proof that Ethiopians can fund and build a megaproject on their own terms. To concede too much in negotiations with Egypt would risk appearing weak, even disloyal to the dream of national sovereignty. Thus, both governments are locked in positions fortified by pride and politics. Behind each technical disagreement lies a fear of domestic backlash. Every statement about water becomes a statement about identity, dignity, and independence. But what makes this conflict especially dangerous is that the physical geography offers no alternative. The Nile cannot be replaced, and its flow cannot be easily replicated. Egypt has explored massive desalination projects and water recycling efforts, but these are costly and energy-intensive. Ethiopia's dam, once fully operational, will have the capacity to generate over 6,000 megawatts of electricity, making it the largest hydropower plant in Africa. Yet, to reach that potential, Ethiopia must fill the reservoir, a process that directly affects Egypt's water share. The simple act of progress for one nation translates into anxiety for another. Throughout the 2020s, efforts at mediation have oscillated between hope and frustration. The African Union, under the principle of African solutions to African problems, has tried to bring both sides together. Negotiations held in Addis Ababa, Khartoum, and Kinshasa have produced frameworks but not final agreements. Each round ends with declarations of friendship and the quiet reality of deadlock. In private, diplomats describe the dispute as one of the most technically solvable but politically intractable crises in modern Africa. The science of river management is clear. Through data sharing, seasonal coordination, and emergency protocols, the GERD could be operated in a way that minimizes harm to downstream countries. But political mistrust runs deeper than hydrology. Egypt doubts that Ethiopia would honor its commitments once the dam is full. Ethiopia doubts that Egypt would ever accept its right to equitable use of the river. The shadow of potential conflict remains. Military analysts occasionally publish speculative reports about how Egypt might use force if negotiations fail. Some envision airstrikes or covert sabotage. Others dismiss such options as impractical. The logistical challenges of striking a target over 1,500 kilometers away across multiple sovereign borders are enormous. Ethiopia's mountainous terrain and growing air defense capabilities make any attack risky and unpredictable. More importantly, such a move would ignite regional instability that could consume the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea corridor, a region already burdened by wars in Sudan, Somalia, and Yemen. In the broader context, the Nile dispute mirrors the global challenge of resource management in an age of scarcity. Around the world, rivers that cross borders, the Mekong, the Indus, the Tigris, and Euphrates, are becoming flashpoints. Population growth, economic ambition, and climate stress are turning shared waters into contested resources. The Nile, once a symbol of unity, risks becoming a symbol of what happens when cooperation fails. But even amid the tension, there are reasons for cautious optimism. In recent years, experts from both sides have quietly collaborated on studies of river flow patterns and drought mitigation strategies. Egyptian engineers have visited Ethiopia for technical discussions, while Ethiopian officials have participated in regional energy forums that include Cairo's representatives. These small, often unpublicized efforts suggest that, beneath the public rhetoric, both nations understand that long-term stability demands dialogue. For regional observers, the question is no longer whether Egypt and Ethiopia will win the Nile dispute, but whether both can find a way to coexist with dignity. The alternative, escalation, would be catastrophic. A military confrontation could disrupt not only water supplies but trade routes, displace millions, and invite foreign militaries into African affairs once again. The Horn of Africa sits near one of the world's busiest maritime choke points, the Suez Canal and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. A regional war could reverberate through global trade and energy markets, affecting far more than the two nations themselves. To prevent such a scenario, analysts propose several paths forward. The first is a comprehensive water-sharing agreement built not on colonial-era quotas, but on modern data and mutual benefit. This would require transparency, real-time monitoring of dam operations, rainfall, and reservoir levels, with guarantees against unilateral actions during drought years. Such systems already exist in other regions. The challenge is not technology, but trust. The second path is regional integration. If Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt were to link their energy grids and water management plans, they could transform the Nile Basin into an engine of shared prosperity. Egypt's industrial base could benefit from Ethiopia's hydropower. Ethiopia could benefit from Egyptian expertise in irrigation and engineering. Together, they could create a model of African interdependence rather than rivalry. But such integration requires political vision, leaders willing to look beyond borders toward a common future. The third path lies in redefining security. For too long, Nile policy has been framed through the lens of threat and defense. Yet the greatest threats to both nations are internal: poverty, youth unemployment, food insecurity, and climate stress. Investing in conflict drains the resources needed to address those problems. Investing in cooperation, on the other hand, could yield exponential returns. In this sense, water security and human security are not opposites. They are the same goal seen from different angles. Ultimately, the fate of the Nile conflict will hinge not on treaties alone, but on leadership and imagination. It will require both Egypt and Ethiopia to confront their histories, to recognize that colonial legacies and national pride, however deeply felt, must yield to practical coexistence. The Nile has seen empires rise and fall, yet it has continued to flow. It does not belong to one nation or another. It belongs to all who depend on it and to the generations yet unborn. As a global analyst might observe, the dispute between Egypt and Ethiopia is a microcosm of our century's greatest challenge: how to share what sustains us. The world's future conflicts will not be fought only over ideology or territory, but over access to the fundamentals of life: water, food, and energy. The Nile story is thus not only an African story, but a human one. When historians look back, they may see this period as a turning point, the moment when nations chose either to cooperate or to collide. Whether the Nile becomes a river of peace or a river of division will depend on the wisdom of those who stand at its banks today. And so the question remains: can Egypt and Ethiopia, two ancient civilizations linked by a single river, find the courage to see beyond fear? Can they write a new chapter where development in one land does not mean deprivation in another? The answer is still unwritten, carried quietly in the current of the Nile itself, a reminder that the forces which sustain life are also the forces that demand balance, humility, and understanding. For as the river flows northward, from the highlands of Ethiopia to the delta of Egypt, it whispers a timeless truth: no nation owns the Nile. All are its children, and only together can they ensure that its waters, the bloodline of Africa, continue to give life, not take it away.